I wanted to begin the day by having a presentation on Indigenous data sovereignty. The reason for this is that data underpins so much of what we do in relationship to governance. From how we govern data to how data governs us, understanding the importance of Indigenous data sovereignty is a must in the world of governance. Our first speaker is the Senior Manager of Indigenous Research at University of Waterloo, Sarah Anderson. Sarah is my boss, and I love her. Sarah comes from a mixed background of German Mennonite and Indigenous heritage. As the daughter of a 60 scoop survivor, her ongoing learning and reconnection journey inspired her to become involved in community organizing for Indigenous rights, with a particular focus on settler education and allyship. She received her MA in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University in 2016, while concurrently completing the Graduate Certificate in Indigenous Policy and Administration at Carleton School of Public Policy and Administration. Her research interests stemmed from the dynamics of Indigenous settler-colonial relationships, with a particular focus on the Mennonite Indigenous historical and contemporary relationships in Southern Ontario. Following her MA, Sarah worked at Kairos Canada, a national nonprofit organization, as the assistant manager for the Kairos Blanket Exercise National Education Program for 5 years. She recently started a new position in the Office of the Vice President, Research and International at the University of Waterloo as the Senior Manager, Indigenous Research, where her focus is on supporting Indigenous faculty at UW, consulting with and offering training for non-Indigenous researchers, and leading strategic projects to advance Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing within the research environment. Please put your hands together for Sarah Anderson. So, Petra, go.
All right. Miigwech Benny, thank you so much. I'm not going to say it's preferential treatment, though, for me going first. So, Ani Bojo Kwe Kwe, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for listening to me. I feel like I should say that I'm not really here as an expert on Indigenous data sovereignty. This is something that I've started learning in the past several years in a research context, really through my role in the VPRI at UW. But what I want to share today is a little bit about what I've learned and why I think it's so important that we have this understanding of these really big words, data sovereignty, and what that means. And really, today in our context, think about what it means to support the effort of regeneration and revitalization of Indigenous governance systems. So diving right in. It's working. Okay. So what is Indigenous data sovereignty? I would say, very broadly speaking, Indigenous data sovereignty is defined as the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities to own, control, access, and possess data that derive from them and which pertain to their members, knowledge systems, customs, territories, or resources. So where do these inherent rights come from? They are inherent, meaning Indigenous peoples have always possessed these rights. And we usually talk about it today in terms of a self-determination framework. These rights have been affirmed in things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They are recognized through some of the treaty frameworks, both, I would say, historical and more contemporary treaties, and other pieces of Canadian legislation, including the Canadian Constitution. So I hope that helps sort of give a sense of why it's important, why it relates to governance. This definition of data sovereignty recognizes that data are a very strategic resource. And this idea of data sovereignty is meant to provide a framework for ethical data use to advance collective Indigenous well-being and self-determination. But you may be wondering, what are Indigenous data then? What is so different about Indigenous data that are separate from quote unquote regular data? Yes. So Indigenous data are data created or generated by, with, for, or about Indigenous people and communities. Data can be both communally held and individually held. Indigenous data often manifest as photos, as videos, sound recordings, texts, maps, geological surveys, climate data, many more manifestations. So I tend to think about it as data showing up in three sort of categories, and they're on the slide here. This is not an exhaustive list, but it helps give a sense of what kind of data we may be talking about. So we talk about traditional and cultural information, archives, oral histories, stories, clan knowledge. But we also talk about data as individual Indigenous people, so like demographic data or socioeconomic data, legal data, health data, but also data about resources and environments, such as geological information or water and climate info. And I think we're going to hear about more of that today later from other speakers. But I feel like this definition of data can feel really like academic or sometimes very clinical. And so I want us to think a little bit about what happens when we think about Indigenous data as sacred. Jeff Ward, who is the CEO of Anamiki, an Indigenous tech company, recently posted this quote, and I was like, this is a perfect quote. So Jeff says, these data are our stories, our people, our kin. Data is in the land. It's in our regalia. It's in our songs. It's in our stories, and it's in our languages. So if we think of data as sacred and data as kin, how does this change our perception of responsible or ethical data management? And how would this change our response to data governance? So I find that there are, in the context of governance, two things that we speak about that outline interests of Indigenous peoples regarding their data. So we have that sense of the first one, data for governance. So Indigenous nations want to use data that we have to transform our lives and the lives of our communities. There's almost an interdependence between data rebuilding or data gathering and nation rebuilding, because having access to this information contributes to advancing our own collective well-being and self-determination. I'm not going to speak further about this framework today because I think we have several speakers who are going to talk about the different projects of rekindling and rebuilding in the context of revitalizing Indigenous governance systems. But I'm going to focus on the second one. So this idea of the governance of data. And again, this relates to data sovereignty. This is essentially the work of Indigenous data sovereignty. So broadly speaking, we see Indigenous peoples and communities now thinking about managing access to that data, managing access to the stories, to the kin, to the regalia, to all of the things that I talked about before, and making sure that the use of this data is relevant, it's responsive, and it minimizes harm and maximizes benefits. So there's lots to say, but I'm going to try to be very brief. There are some global movements of Indigenous data sovereignty, and we're starting to see the rise of some of these in different nation states. But what I'd like to focus on or just highlight briefly is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, their work on developing the CARE principles. So the aim of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance is to progress international Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance in order to advance Indigenous control of Indigenous data. And the GIDA network is comprised of Indigenous researchers, data practitioners, and policy activists advocating for international Indigenous data sovereignty. So in 2019, they developed this model of Be Fair and Care. For those of you who are new to data discussions, the acronym FAIR is often applied in the context of big data or open data, or maybe you've heard the term open science. But there's a challenge with this. So the GIDA network proposed the CARE principles, which briefly are about collective benefit. So data, ecosystems, and the way that we structure data shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from the data. Authority to control. Indigenous peoples' rights and interests must be recognized, and their authority to make decisions about who gets to access it, when it should be accessed, and how it's and how we're represented in the data. That's an inherent right and important part of Indigenous data sovereignty. Responsibility. Those who are working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to show how these data are used to support our self-determination and collective benefit. And then E, ethics. Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of what we call the data life cycle or the research ecosystem. So I would say that one of the other things that I've learned from folks in the GITA network is that the current movement that we see to open data or big data or open science, it doesn't really fully engage with Indigenous people's rights and interests. The idea of the open data movement is really about how do we make sure that data can be shared easily among entities. But this really ignores power differentials and historical contexts. So this emphasis on sharing and being able to share alone, this is a tension for Indigenous peoples who are also asserting greater control over the use of Indigenous data for collective benefit and governance. We as Indigenous peoples have the right to create value from Indigenous data in ways that are grounded in our worldviews and allow us to realize our own opportunities and our own futures. So I think the CARE principles here are really meant to be both people and purpose-driven. And they are really, I think, they really reflect the crucial role of data in trying to advance Indigenous governance. But in the interest of time, I just want to briefly move forward to Canada. So many Indigenous communities in the land that we now call Canada have begun to define different models and principles of data management and governance. So these models are all distinct, but I think as you can see from, the next slide. As you can see from my picture here, I think they're all sort of rooted and they have several commonalities across them. So while the wildflowers may all be different, they're all part of the same kind of ecosystem and grounded in the same kind of soil. So I'm not going to go into detail again about all of these, but the one data management framework that you might have heard of and is starting to become more well-known is the First Nations Principles of OCAP, which stand for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. So our team, just a shout out, will be hosting an OCAP webinar in October and everyone is invited to attend. It's going to be virtual. Feel free to email Benny if you'd like to attend and you can't find the information online. So I also just want to say very briefly that there's a lot of questions that remain regarding the implementation of Indigenous data sovereignty principles and also their relationship with current intellectual property frameworks. And that's what I'm really grappling with right now at the University of Waterloo. Although Indigenous nations and communities have always been experts in our data, in our information, there are some challenges with this era of big data or open data. So some of these challenges include the fact that every single Indigenous community has enormous collections of tangible and intangible cultural material, knowledge, data that's held elsewhere. It's held in archives, it's held in museums or libraries or universities or in online databases. And many times significant information about this data is lost. We don't have individual names or community names. And that sort of that breaks some of the cycle of understanding when we can pass on that information. In these contexts, Indigenous people aren't often recognized as the rights holders. So we have no control over what happens in these collections, and even accessing these collections is a challenge. There's often significant mistakes in digital metadata, so how we archive and tag things online, and that continues on into the lives of this digital material. And now more than ever, there are more and more researchers who want to work with communities and collect data and collect samples from our communities. And operating in sort of a policy vacuum is the challenge. So where do we start? For me, in that research context, this starts with really individual research projects and having researchers implement wise practices as best we're able. So this might include seeking active collaboration and partnership with Indigenous communities or developing data agreements based on the needs of the community. So one example, as a speaker today, I worked with Benny to co-create a data sharing agreement about what my presentation and how I would like this to be shared, and who can share it, and what are the uses and inappropriate uses, like no selling of this, please, and things like that. It's a really small example, but it is a literal concrete step in how we can advance Indigenous data sovereignty. But ultimately, I think as long as we continue on this collective and individual learning journey with open minds, that we come together in that good way and that good heart, that good spirit, and as our Haudenosaunee kin say, with that one mind, I think we have a lot of things to be excited about. So I'm going to end there, but Chimigwech, thank you so much, everyone. And I look forward to sharing and learning with you later.